I'm delighted to introduce you to Jonathan Hemus, who's joining us today and who's hosting with a bit of technical difficulty here and there. But we're all learning new things, aren't we, in these crazy times. He's agreed to present to us today. Jonathan and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the sorts of conversations that we're having with some of our contacts and some of our clients. And this subject came up a lot for both of us, understandably in Jonathan's case. Obviously, this is the work that he does. But certainly I was finding that a lot of the clients and contacts that we've been working with, directors of comms, etc., have real concerns about this subject and what they're doing to prepare and for if there is any other further crisis, which of course crisis comes, maybe nothing quite like the one that we have been currently in. So it seemed like a great idea to team up and deliver this webinar to support the comms community. Hopefully, I mentioned my 8-year-old son. I do have an 8-year-old who does like to come in quite regularly to my Zooms as I'm trying to work from home. Hopefully he won't, but if he does, he'll probably give us a demonstration of the plot and everyone will have to learn how to do that. We will take questions, etc. at the end, and please do use the group chat, which I can see some of you are already, which is great, thank you, to ask questions, and we will pick up on those as we go and make sure that you have that opportunity to ask Jonathan questions at the end, or myself obviously, or any of the team. And without further ado, I will hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you everyone else for joining this session. My apologies that I am not a technical guru, so if I have failed to unmute anyone, I do give you my sincere apologies. The good news is that I am an expert in crisis communication, so hopefully from this point forward, I should be in control of matters. Quick introduction, yeah, I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We are a specialist crisis management consultancy. We work with leaders of businesses around the world to help them do and say the right things on the worst days of their business careers, and that's through crisis management planning, training, exercising, and advice. We work with people from Cathay Pacific to Lidl to Sky and Waitrose, a whole range of organisations. And sadly, clearly over the last couple of months, pretty much all of our clients and every other business in the world has been dealing with a crisis at exactly the same time. And I know that for many of the people on this call, it will have been relentless the last couple of months, you know, clearly dealing with personal stresses, but also professional challenges. And so, yeah, over the next 25 to 30 minutes ahead of questions, I wanted to talk you through about taking a breath, really, taking the opportunity now as we start to come out of lockdown in the UK, as we start to move to whatever this legendary new normal is, what we should be thinking about in terms of what you have done as communicators already and what I believe you should be doing looking to the future. So I'm going to talk about briefly, how do you want to be remembered as an organisation? Some thoughts on the danger zone. I believe we are heading towards the danger zone now from a reputational point of view. And therefore, two things that I think you should be doing over the coming weeks. A review of communication so far and a rescoping of where you want to go to from this point forward. And we will, as I say, have a discussion, and I'm happy to take any questions once I've run through these slides. So that first question, how do you want to be remembered, as a hero or as a villain of the pandemic? Clearly, what you have done already within your business or as a consultant for your clients or for your organization will have already created memories amongst your stakeholders, whether they're employees, whether they're customers, whether they're investors. What you have done in the very first phase of this pandemic will have already created memories. And I think those memories will live long. I think that, you know, heroes and villains of this situation have emerged. More will emerge over the coming months, and I don't think those memories will fade fast. So I think for those people that have created the right memories, that is going to serve them really well, both in the short to medium term, but I think also in the longer term. I think those that have created the wrong memories, I think those negative connotations will live long with their stakeholders. And, you know, there are some organisations like Admiral who've done some really great things, have been proactive. And so, you know, Admiral, the insurance company, announcing customer refunds simply because people are not using their cars as much. That was a great initiative to actually.
Walk, haven't you?
Let me see if I
yeah,
can.
Yeah. Mine won't be going out.
Okay. Yeah, so to actually seize the initiative and to give money back is a counterintuitive thing for an insurance company to do, but gain them great kudos, and I think that will serve them well in future. Equally, in the early stages, you may recall that the luxury goods manufacturer LVMH switched its perfume making line to making hand sanitizers. So a really good use of creativity, and again, unexpected. People expect luxury brands to be standoffish, not really interested in the general public. This was a great way of LVMH doing the right thing and being seen to do the right thing. There are others that have been criticised for not doing that. We saw very early on when Sports Direct positioned themselves or sought to position themselves as an essential service, and then also jacked up the prices of home sports equipment. I think that will not be helpful to them in the longer term. And I think what's really interesting at this time is that even those who have had phenomenal reputations, with missteps during the pandemic, those phenomenal reputations have come under fire. And I think Richard Branson is probably the highest profile example of that. As I say, the man who was the epitome of a superb reputation and a superb personal and business reputation, who has come under fire for taking steps that some people felt were not appropriate. So images, memories have already formed based on what people have done in the first phase of the pandemic. My view is that actually, though, the real danger zone for reputation is beginning now. Why is that? Well, I think there are a number of reasons why your reputation, your organisation's reputation, is more under threat now than it was a month ago. Here are some of the reasons. Firstly, when we think about, responding to the crisis, or we should probably call it an issue now rather than a crisis, surprise is no longer an excuse. Now, there's been criticism around organisations not being prepared for a pandemic when they could have been prepared. We knew there was a possibility of a pandemic. What's for sure is we now definitively know that the virus is with us for a long time. So if we could be forgiven for not having all the answers and making one or two missteps first time round, that excuse of surprise cannot be used again. Sadly, you are more vulnerable because your resources are depleted at the moment. As you've seen from my technological fumbling earlier on, your teams are dispersed. You are not operating at full efficiency yet in this new virtual home working environment. Your business may be financially depleted. Some of its operations may not be working to full speed. Some of your supply chain may not be working 100% effectively. So in this new phase, you won't have your full resources available. I guess critically, from a communication point of view, I think in a sense there was a little bit of safety in numbers in the first phase. Individual businesses, unless they did something seriously wrong or inappropriate, were not criticised for a suboptimal crisis response because everybody was grappling with it. And whilst we're now seeing government come under greater scrutiny, to this point, I think businesses largely have not come under individual media scrutiny, and I think that will change in future. I think customer expectations are higher. So when we look across our stakeholder groups, I think businesses have responded really well to this situation. You know, it's true that organizations, you know, rise to a crisis, and it creates great teamwork, and some of the fantastic things that organizations have done in terms of supporting key workers and being, you know, really flexible in the way that they work, that's fantastic. But maybe some of that wonderful philanthropy and going above and beyond will actually be expected in future as well. So that is another challenge. An even bigger challenge, I think, is going to be maintaining employee morale. Again, we've had, you know, what's been dubbed the blitz spirit over the last couple of months. As I say, in any crisis over the years, when I've watched organizations dealing with crises, it's a real galvanizing force for an organization, and it's been a galvanizing force for the country. But as this situation continues month after month after month, hopefully coming to an end at some point, but not in the next few months, maintaining that positivity, morale, and motivation, I think is going to be a challenge. And the last point is something that, you know, I've observed in all crisis situations. So long as an organization makes a pretty good fist of dealing with a one-off crisis, they will be forgiven. People who fail twice to respond effectively to a crisis are punished far more harshly. So, you know, you may have been given a bit of a pass for some suboptimal responses to the initial phase of the pandemic. I think the outside world, your stakeholders, will be less forgiving as we move into this new phase. We have done research with a number of organisations, and I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of these statistics. Firstly, the one at the very top. So sadly, 62% of businesses said they are now more vulnerable to the impact of a crisis than before COVID-19. And if we go down to the penultimate 42%, 42% of businesses said that another crisis would have a serious or extremely serious impact on their business. Let me just see if I can. There we go. So what that is saying to me now is businesses recognise that a second crisis could have a real impact on their organisation and their reputation, and that they are more vulnerable to that impact. So now really is the time to plan and prepare. Indeed, in the words of the director of the WHO, now is the time for preparation, not celebration. I'm sorry I can't be more upbeat, but as a crisis manager, we have to be realistic. So preparing for what is coming next is really important. And when I say preparing for what is coming next, I kind of mean it in two contexts. Firstly, we are going to have more of the pandemic crisis. We know it's not going away immediately. We're hearing it may well spike again in the autumn or winter, hopefully not sooner. So we absolutely need to be sure that we are ready to respond, if not perfectly, really effectively to further outbreaks or further impacts of coronavirus. But secondly, you also, as organizations and advisors, need to make sure that your business is prepared for a secondary crisis unrelated to COVID-19, but which could severely harm a business which is already under pressure and strain given what it's been through over the last couple of months. And there are, examples of that already appearing. The Whirlpool washing machine issue, which, as we know, has been rumbling on for a number of years. In the last 3 weeks, they have extended fire fault checks to a further 55,000 UK washing machines. So, you know, that is a crisis that Whirlpool could do without at the moment. You may or may not have noticed that in the last week, VW lost a legal case regarding Dieselgate. Again, that is bad news that VW could have done without at a time when business is not as strong as it would normally be. Not many cars being sold at the moment. They didn't need this to deal with as well. Many of you will have seen the EasyJet cyber attack. Again, you will be aware that the cyber criminals are taking advantage of coronavirus. They're aware that people are working from home and don't have the same levels of protection around them. They're also aware that people are expecting emails from the WHO or their bank or from retailers talking about different ways of operating. And so there's a lot of phishing attacks. There's a lot of other kinds of attacks. So a lot of businesses, including EasyJet, are vulnerable to cyber incidents. And then there was a big environmental incident in the States last week. Dow Chemical had a release of nasty toxic stuff into flood water, and as the headline suggests, had to face a crisis whilst managing another crisis. So I think it's really important, as I say, to prepare for both coronavirus response, but also, if I can put it this way, for your normal crises, because either one of those could seriously destabilize an organization which is already under significant pressure. So, Warren Buffett's famous saying, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently, I think is truer today than it has been for a long time. I think missteps over the next few months could be really painful and could cause some really long-term harm. So that's the context. What are some of the things that I would suggest you should be thinking about doing to make sure that you are best placed to ward off those threats and to emerge from the next 6 months with your reputation well and truly intact? So I'm going to spend just 5 to 10 minutes walking through some of the things that I think would be valuable for you to think about. So, firstly, I think it's really important right now to do a review of your communication so far. I'm sure most of you have been working relentlessly under intense pressure in far from ideal working circumstances, with personal situations that you've been dealing with, and an awful lot at stake. I hope I'm muting the right people, but let me just do that. Okay. So it would be understandable if your head had been down for the last few months, focused on what has to be done in a real firefighting situation. What I would really encourage you to do now is to lift your head back up, pause, and review before continuing that kind of mad dash forward. So what I'm suggesting is a review, and that is, I would say, a facilitated review with you and your colleagues to identify what has gone well, what has not gone so well with regards to your crisis communication response. So sit down with said colleagues and run through these questions and these areas. First one, what were your crisis communication objectives for your COVID-19 response? Now, I always think, even in a crisis, it's important to have objectives. Unless you know where you are aiming to get to explicitly, the danger is that a group of people go off in slightly different directions because you aren't clear on where it is that you are aiming for. So hopefully you had crisis communication objectives. If you didn't, I think the other questions still apply, but it's really helpful if you map what you did against what you were aiming to achieve. So if you have objectives, what were they? And how did your crisis communication response play out in practice? How did what you did map against what you were aiming to achieve? And identify what went well. And I would emphasize that, because in some of these reviews, there is a danger of only focusing on things that didn't go so well, things that didn't work or were missing. It is just as important to focus on what went well, because by identifying what went well, you can embed that in your crisis communication approach going forward and make sure that that becomes the way of always doing things in future. So what went well and what didn't go well? And then the flip side of that, with hindsight, if we were to have our time again, what would we do the same? That again becomes embedded in your future approach. And what would you do differently? So with hindsight, what different approaches would you have taken? Review your communication materials. Again, how effective were they in the cold light of day? How clear were they? Was the tone of voice appropriate? Looking at them again, are they sufficiently practical? Are they aligned with your values? And having done that analysis, learn from those and apply those learnings in future. I've talked about sitting down with your team and having this discussion. I think it's really valuable, of course, to take stakeholder feedback at this point. You have been doing your very best to communicate with your various stakeholders, but either via online surveys or one-on-one phone calls or Zoom calls, I think it now would be a really good moment to check in with your key stakeholders and say, how are you feeling about the communication you've received? Was there enough of it? Was the tone appropriate? What was missing? What would you have liked different? So check in with your stakeholders before continuing down these same set of tram lines. And having gone through that process, as with any meeting or workshop, the critical thing at the end of it is to commit to action. Out of the discussion and out of the consultancy with stakeholders, what are we going to do? Who is going to do that, and by when? So not just a talking shop, but actually coming out with some clear actions. There's a second part of the communication review that I would encourage you to look at. This is about your communication plan, response, strategy, and materials. I think it's really important that you look at your team as well, because again, there are more battles to be fought over the coming months, and making sure that we're in the best shape to do that is going to be really important. So this is about reviewing team resilience and purpose. Suggested questions. How are we feeling now? Again, taking a step back, just checking in with the team. What are we personally proud of? Again, I think it's so important to celebrate success and celebrate what we have achieved at a time which has been hugely challenging. And there will have been, people who have gone well above and beyond the call of duty, and there will be things that you rightly should be proud about. So identify and recognize those. What have we learned about ourselves? There may be, skills that we've identified. There may have been weaknesses that we've identified, but we need to understand those so that we can deploy people most effectively as we move forward. What surprised us about what played out? What have we found most challenging? Then turn the focus on the future. How do we feel about the future? What are our hopes looking forward? What are our fears looking forward? And based on all of that, what help or support do we need? And that could be technological support, it could be human support, it could be all kinds of help or support. But if we're going to keep up this effort for the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 months, what would help to make our lives easier or better? What would enable us to be more effective as a team going forward? And again, commit to action. That will be a really valuable and cathartic session but it will have only made a difference if you commit to action subsequently. So, communication review, both in terms of the communication response itself, but also a review of how your team feels, how it operated, how it can operate at high intensity going forward. Talking about going forward, I wanted to share with you some areas to be thinking about in terms of planning and safeguarding your future and your reputation. I just want to pick up on one particular area, which again, I think is a particularly important one to look at right now, and that's prioritization of stakeholders. I put that picture in the presentation to remind ourselves of what employee communications looked like only 2 months ago, and it looks a little bit different now. But I think it's really important at this point to say, maybe we've been prioritizing our employees and our customers above all else over the last couple of months. Let's just check that that is still the right focus as we go back into business as usual mode, where we need to start marketing and selling our products and services again. You know, is that still the right prioritization? The answer may be yes, but I'm just counseling you to check that what was right and appropriate 3 weeks ago will still be right and appropriate in a month's time. So have a close look at your stakeholders. Are you still placing your attention in the right places? From a specifically kind of crisis communication perspective, I would strongly encourage you to reassess your reputational risk landscape. Any organization that believes its reputational risk landscape is the same today as it was 2 months ago must either be extremely fortunate and or unique, or deluded, because clearly the external context in which you're operating has changed dramatically, and almost certainly the shape of your business or organization has changed dramatically in terms of the ways in which it's operating, in terms of its potentially weakened state, whether that's weakened operations, finances, human resource. So therefore, the risks that you were facing 2 months ago are not identical to the risks that you are facing now. And in order to protect yourself from those risks, you need to identify what they are. For example, because businesses have risen to the challenge over the last couple of months, and because there have been great examples of humanity and philanthropy, and because this is such a human crisis, I would suggest that examples of corporate greed or, you know, dodgy tax affairs would probably be more damaging to an organization post this first phase of coronavirus than it would have been a couple of months ago. So that's just one example of where the impact of a particular risk type would be greater on your organization now than it would have been a couple of months ago. I would then encourage you to take some of your critical risk areas, and it could be, you know, cyber attack, for example, and to sit down both with your communication colleagues, but also a broader group of people to walk through how would we respond if this secondary crisis came along. Make sure by going through that process that you've identified some of the key decision points, that you know that you have the resources that you would need, and that you've worked out how you would deal with such a situation in a home working environment, or in an environment which is not the same as the one that you were working in a couple of months ago. So don't wait for the crisis to happen to work out how you would deal with it in this new set of circumstances. Couple of final slides before opening up for discussion and questions. I mentioned on the 2 review slides that you need to commit to action. One of those actions I would suggest must be to update and enhance your crisis communication plan. how effective was it in dealing with the first wave? What were the resources that you wished you'd had that you didn't have? What processes worked really effectively? What processes didn't work so effectively? What checklists were missing? Ask yourselves those questions as part of the review, and then update and enhance that crisis communication plan accordingly. If your remit extends to the crisis management plan as well, go through the same process. It would be criminal, not literally, but almost, it would be criminal to go through all of the pain of dealing with the first crisis, to have identified areas where plans could have been enhanced and ways of working could have been improved, not to address them, and then to fall foul of a secondary crisis. And clearly on the back of that, you then need to brief those responsible for deploying that plan on what those changes mean for them. So the time is now, I believe, to prepare for the future. I do believe we are going into the danger zone for individual organisations. The context has changed. Your planning needs to reflect that. So review and then make changes to ensure that you are well prepared for the future. I'm just going to, before taking questions, draw your attention to some additional resources we have available on our website. These are all free. They're all either just there for you or downloadable without even providing any email addresses. But I think you might find particularly the two webinars at the bottom. There are webinar recordings from Gus Whitcomb from Cathay Pacific and Steve Stewart from Stagecoach, both talking about the learning process that they are going through. So as you maybe begin to think about your learning process, I would commend particularly both of those webinar recordings to you, because both Gus and Steve have some really powerful insights. So I'm going to call a halt there, and Lucy, maybe you can pick up in terms of facilitating questions.
I will. Hello, Jonathan. Thank you very much for that. That was fantastic, really insightful stuff and very useful. And I'm sure that a lot of you feel like you probably haven't taken very many breaths over the last couple of months. And I think it is really important to take this time to review, to help protect the business, and obviously to protect yourselves and your sanity, really, I suppose, in terms of what's coming next or what's potentially coming next. Hopefully it won't come, but we have to prepare, don't we, for the worst. And certainly on the comms side, I think that's what you need to do for your businesses. So thank you again, Jonathan. I'm sure some of you have got questions, so please feel free to either use the group chat, or if anyone would like to come off mute, we'll let you off now, I promise, and ask a question. So does anyone have any questions that they'd like to put to Jonathan?
Hello. I'll chip in with one if I may.
You may.
Thank you. Jonathan, my name is Paul McCaffrey. Really interesting. I will declare an interest in that. I'm a former head of comms for a fire service and a former director of comms for a health trust.
Yes.
Just give me your thoughts on how often your crisis communications plan should be tested and refined, if you would.
So I would suggest in normal circumstances, and it does clearly depend to an extent on the nature of the organisation. You know, some organisations, some of our clients would typically test every quarter. I would suggest that that is appropriate if you are in a high risk sector, but as a minimum, I would be advocating an annual exercise or simulation, more often if possible, but I am a huge advocate of exercises and simulations, not just because we sell them, but because I think it is the single most important thing that an organization can do to be ready for a crisis. And we saw significant differences in the speed and quality of response between organizations that had taken that step before the pandemic and those that hadn't. You know, some clients had a pandemic specific plan, and that was fantastic and had rehearsed it. Others didn't. They had a general crisis management plan which had been rehearsed. Either way, they were much more sure-footed in their response. So in the normal course of things, I would, maybe too strong a word, but I've seen the perils of not doing, I would plead with organizations to do at least one exercise a year. It's only by doing that that you build up the muscle memory and the kind of confidence with the ways of working that means that a crisis communication or management plan goes from being, you know, a set of words on, you know, on a piece of paper to being something that really underpins your crisis response. At the moment, of course, and that's really, I suppose, the whole tenet of my presentation, even if you did an exercise 3 or 4 months ago, I would still advocate reviewing your crisis comms or crisis management plan now to make sure that the learnings from 3 or 4 months ago are still relevant and that there aren't new things that need to be added.
Okay.
Thank you for your question, Paul.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Jonathan?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question about messaging moving into the next sector, next phase.
Yeah.
Because I think quite rightly the government's been criticised for, or the UK government has been criticised for moving from being having a really clear set of messaging to one that's quite ambiguous.
Yeah.
And I am conscious, though, we're not planning for returning to normal office work, but we're starting to think about planning.
Yes.
Moving back.
Yes.
Even at this early stage, it strikes me that the messaging is going to be a lot more complicated,
yes,
a lot more nuanced.
Yes.
And I think it's going, and whereas people have, I think, or certainly in the organisation that I work for, understand how the decisions have been made,
Yeah.
and certain groups have been treated slightly differently depending on their method of working, you know, suddenly there's going to be a whole heap of more complication on both the kind of employer side, but also on the employee side, because everyone's in different positions. And I kind of wonder, I'm wondering about how I balance clarity, consistency, and conciseness, and because I think somewhere one of them's going to have to go. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that would be.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Jeremy. So some thoughts. I think you're absolutely right that certainly initially, maybe not so much now, the government advice was very clear initially. And I think, again, to my kind of danger zone conversation, that was really helpful for businesses, because many businesses could simply default to, quite rightly, follow the government advice. This is very, very clear. To your point, it is becoming more nuanced, one might even say confusing, as to what the message from government is. What I would therefore say is that is another reason why the communication challenge is greater for businesses going forward. And I guess my starting point would be, therefore, your messaging going forward needs to be based on the leadership of your organization, the values for which the organization stands, the culture of the organization, and the business reality. But this is where I think organizations are going to have to step forward and decide. So I guess it's actions as well as words. They need to decide what is appropriate in terms of what we expect of people going forward and how they should work going forward. And that is going to be a judgment those individual organizations are going to have to take, mindful of government advice, but based on their values and what they believe the right thing to do is. I guess my instinct then would be to say, having kind of strategically decided what the right thing to do and say is, I would then be trying to make whatever you have decided as clear and as simple as possible. In the absence of the government making it clear and simple, even if you can't be kind of 100% sure that what you are suggesting is right, I think clarity would be very, very helpful. So I would follow your values, do the right thing, and then communicate what that right thing is as clearly as you possibly can. And as with the first phase of the situation, be prepared to flex and change as the situation changes. I think one of the things that businesses, and particularly business leaders, grappled with in the early stages was uncertainty and the sheer dynamism of the situation that meant that what was right yesterday, it was right yesterday, isn't right today. So again, it may be that you set certain guidelines in place for next week that, by the end of the month, they need to change again. And we need to be comfortable with that uncertainty and with that flexibility, I think. Hopefully that answers your question to some extent.
Yes, it's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that question. There's a question coming through on the group chat, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan, if you want to take a look, it's from Michael Oakes at Virgin Atlantic.
I'm not sure that I am...
I can read it out for you.
Please.
I'm going to read it out for you. So, quick question for Jonathan. It says, as crisis comms lead at an airline, I keep saying to myself that this is a golden age for our part of the profession.
Yes.
How do you think this period is going to change the fundamental role and position of crisis comms in not only broader comms, but business in general? And there is a thank you at the end.
So I would agree with you. As communicators, we are sometimes, depending on the organization that we work within, fighting to have our voice heard. I've always found that in a crisis, the communicator's voice is valued and is wanted in the room. I think this situation absolutely has shown the importance of communication and also crisis management. And I think going forward, no longer will organisations be able to say this couldn't happen to us, and if a crisis does happen, we will muddle through. Any organisation that now doesn't engage in crisis management and crisis communication training, I would say, is extremely foolhardy. So yeah, I guess I would agree. Out of crisis does come opportunity. I think this has been a real opportunity for communicators to demonstrate their value. I think they have been, in many cases, the number one advisor that chief executives have turned to, and I hope and believe that will continue going forward.
Thanks, Jonathan. I hope that answers your question, Michael. Any other questions for Jonathan before we wrap up for today?
Hi, it's Robin Gray here. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Robin.
I'm with Global Knowledge, which is a global IT training business.
Yeah.
Headquartered in the US, though I actually live in Belgium. One of the things that I've noticed through this crisis amongst my customers, my shareholders, stakeholders, and my staff, is a very wide range of opinion, from those who think the whole thing is dreadfully over-exaggerated or some sort of conspiracy, to those who think the world's ending, we should, never open office again. And also, there's a big difference. There's a mainstream media approach, and then there's a much more aggressive social media approach, which is actually extremely distrustful of the mainstream media.
Yeah.
So I've never seen a crisis where there has been that sort of spread of opinion, and that diversity amongst the channels. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how that's going to affect the future, or how we should be thinking about managing that.
Yeah, I guess First thing I would say is I concur, and it makes the situation again even more challenging. I guess maybe the angle I'd come back on specifically, if we think about what we need to do as communicators, and I think, in the first phase of the crisis, internal communication has been critically important, and I think going forward, internal communication and customer communication are going to be critically important in terms of giving people the confidence to either come to work or do work, and or to buy our services, or to jump on one of our aeroplanes or use one of our buses or come to our restaurants. So I think the challenge and the tightrope that we will need to walk is being empathetic to the range of views that you were describing. And I'm now talking about, the real range of views amongst the people with whom we're dealing, our customers and our employees. At one extreme, we can't clearly simply just say, don't be silly, don't worry, your chance of getting it, you're young, is blah, blah, blah. We have to be empathetic, and we need to understand the real anxieties that people may still be facing. But then I think we flip the coin over, and the other thing that I think we can do as communicators is to help the leaders of our organizations to inspire confidence. And if I can call that empathetic confidence, but actually, in the absence potentially of political leaders that your employees or your customers may fully believe in, and maybe in the absence of media that your employees or customers may fully believe in, I think the role of leaders within organizations to create that hope and confidence in the future is even greater. And I think it is a role that we as communicators can help them with. So I have no perfect answer to your question. I certainly recognize the situation you're describing. And I think, as I say, my best advice thinking about what that means in terms of communication is treading that fine balance between empathy, but also playing a leading role in being part of creating confidence and hope in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our solution was to be very consistent in our communication and messaging the whole way through, and explaining how we reached our thinking, and sticking to that line, and not allowing people from either side with different opinions to maneuver us.
Good. And I think the other thing, in the organisation that you've described, and there'll be many others on the call that are grappling with this clearly, you operate in Belgium, the States, and I'm sure other parts around the world. So you have, the pandemic is at different stages in different countries and different regions. The political guidance, the medical advice is different. So it is a far from straightforward challenge.
Yeah, that's this week's work.
Thank you for your question. I've got another question that's come through from my colleague and fellow exec director, Willem de Ruyter, who's based in the Netherlands. So Willem, I'll let you ask your question.
Yeah, good afternoon all. Within VMA, I'm in charge of, let's say, the non-UK business. Mm-hmm. I've got actually a big concern in the sense that we do see communications departments being extremely busy these days.
Yes.
Employee engagement higher on the agenda than ever before. All the day-to-day issues as they come these days. At the same time, the good thing is they do have a seat at the table, by the way. At the same time, they're preparing future company narratives. They're busy. Now, when within your introduction, you rightly said, think and prepare.
Yeah.
I'm worried that at the moment, there just is no time or capacity within many companies to do just that. What would you tell these companies?
I would say you are entering the danger zone. I would say I understand why it is difficult to slow down and reflect, but I would encourage them to do so, because I think the downside of not doing that now is too awful to contemplate. If you have made it this far and the business is intact and still in business, And it doesn't have to be, you know, a week-long strategic summit, but to take half a day in which you reflect, learn, and act, the amount of unnecessary damage that could be saved by that has to be worth the investment. And I think it's about the organisation just being disciplined enough to do that. It's the same as us as individuals, isn't it? At the moment, although we're on lockdown, many of us, I find my days are very, very full, but you do need to take time to reflect as well as just do things. So I guess my main thrust would be the very real dangers of not taking that time out.
Thanks. Agreed.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, I'm very conscious of time, so I think we've come to the end of the session, but I'm sure Jonathan would be very happy if anyone's got questions to hear from you directly.
Yeah. Just
yeah,
flick that up. There's my contact details.
Oh my word,
As though it was planned.
Jonathan. It was, exactly. But you know, all I need to say is thank you so much, Jonathan, for your time, and for everyone as well for joining us today. I think it's been great. And absolutely, I agree. We need to people need to take a bit of a breather and try and review this. So I think that's very sage advice. And I hope you all get to enjoy a bit of lovely sunshine. I hear the weekend's going to be delightful coming up. So I do hope you get a bit of time to take a breather over that period of time. Thank you very much, and we will see you again soon.